Good morning. I hope my notes are in this folder. Also, the last time I haven't taught. Do you know I haven't taught in the Challengers class for, I think, almost 2 years. And did you also know that whenever I teach, it's always Palm Sunday and Easter? So Mike Moore just asked me if I had all new material. Yeah, we've been here before. We've been here before. Several weeks ago, I ran across this statement. Christian creativity begins with grief. I know, isn't that interesting? And I cannot find where I read it now, so we'll just have to go with anonymity right now. It's not mine. Christian creativity begins with grief. Now that statement really touched me. Somewhere deep inside, it struck a chord. It may be, as I said, it's because this is the first time I've taught this class since Don passed away. As you all remember, because you've surrounded me with so much love and care during that time, he died almost 2 years ago. And it has taken me a while to return to teaching work in the aftermath of his passing. Now, one of the things I've had to realize in this season that I feel like I'm just coming out of is that Don started dying long before he died. As you all know, he had Parkinson's. And so in some ways, I've been in a season of death with him for really a number of years. Not since he was first diagnosed with Parkinson's. That was like 20 years ago, and we were so dadgum naive. Life just went on. Take another pill. Gets a little worse, take another pill. Gets another worse, take another pill. But the last couple of years, there was no pills that could solve anything. Christian creativity begins with grief. Maybe I'm thinking about that because in my professional life, creativity is actually coming to fruition at Phillips Theological Seminary. Like our church, our beloved church, Phillips was rocked by COVID. I read somewhere, I just read this stuff and then I can't give it attribution. I read somewhere that COVID for churches and for seminaries did not cause beneath. It just ripped off the Band-Aids. So we were already struggling with what it meant to be church, and suddenly, do you realize 3 years ago, Palm Sunday, I came on Friday, and we filmed my Sunday school lesson for the Challengers. Remember, that was that time when none of us knew what to do, and it was the first time that I had to give a Sunday school lesson to an empty room. It is truly the oddest thing in the world. And now I've kind of gotten used to it. Anyway, at Phillips, now that we've come through COVID, there's a number of really wonderful things happening that are different than they've ever been before. And I, of course, want to claim all the credit. But it's not me. It's this wonderful team of folks I get to work with. So let me just give you one example, and next week I'll bring brochures. Our dean, whom you all have met, and he's led a lesson here, Dr. Lee H. Butler Jr., founded the Tulsa Race Massacre Lectureship, the year of the centennial of the race massacre. This is the second year we're going to be having it, and it has now bloomed into the Tulsa Race Massacre lectureship on April the 24th, which I'm sure you will all immediately write down in your calendars, but also now includes an art exhibit. So a couple of weeks ago, I flew down to Houston to meet one of the major artists named Harvey Johnson, who is a black artist who came to our Race Massacre lectureship last year and was so moved. He organized an art exhibit of his art, his students' art, and his patron's art, a guy named John Biggers. Now, in the African American art world, this is a big deal. I, of course, know nothing about art, so I just nod along. But the paintings themselves are so in their depiction of both religious life and struggle and black life and struggle. And so Christian creativity begins with grief. And another reason this strikes me, I am going to get to a lesson, you're going to hear it in a minute, but you all know me. That's usually the last 5 seconds. I've been reading a theological classic called God is Red, R-E-D. It was written by a Native American Indian theologian named Vine Deloria, who has since passed away. And last year at Phillips, we had a 50th anniversary of the publication of this book because it challenged a lot of presuppositions about white Christianity. So Dr. Deloria says this. He's discussing death and religion. And he points out that in much Christianity, death is seen as an enemy to be overcome, or denied, or ignored, not as a part of the whole of life. Now, one only has to think of Paul's cry in his epistles when he says, "Oh, death, now you've lost your sting." One only has to think that here's how we read Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve, they were really wanting to know more because the serpent was tempting them there in the garden. And even though God said they weren't supposed to eat of the fruit of that tree, the serpent said, "Oh, yeah, you should." So they ate it, and they got death. And the way that Christians read that, death looks like punishment. Interestingly enough, Jews don't read it quite the same way, and if you want to know more about that, ask Dr. Lisa Davison to come to Sunday school and tell you about that. But we emphasize death as punishment, death as disruption, death as not normal. And that's what Dr. Deloria is taking a shot at and challenging us to think more like a Native American way of understanding death. And that is death as a part of the whole of life, so that there's balance. To have joy, there must be grief. To have life, there must be death. To have pain, there must be a remedy of salvation or wholeness or hope. Well, I thought, well, that's interesting. Plus, Dr. Deloria, you're mischaracterizing Christianity in a large way. And so I turned to my usual companion. Big surprise here, the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John is my comfort food. It's where I go when I don't know what else to think about in terms of some of the deeper and most important questions, puzzles, things in our life. So it's no surprise that once again I go there, and this time I opened up chapter 11, which I'm quite sure you have memorized. Chapter 11 is the story of Jesus' raising of Lazarus. And with the help of some wise commentators, I reread this story, and I'm going to invite you to reread this to see what we can understand about death as we move into Holy Week. Now, that brought me to thinking about, before I go there, that brought me to thinking about holiness. What makes something holy? And it occurred to me that it may be that death makes something holy. When I used to lead youth groups back in the dark ages, we would go to camp, and the kids would come back, and you'd ask them how camp was, and they'd say, "Oh, it was fabulous. We got real close, cried a lot, and talked about death." And those grounds on which those camps are held are pretty daggum sacred to those of us who grew up on them. Pretty holy. Pretty holy. So Holy Week. And Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem and is about to do something that's going to bring about his death. So I am at the Gospel of John, chapter 11. I'm not starting at the beginning. You'll be glad to know. Except for one thing. I want to remind you, and this isn't new, Mike, I'm sorry, and I'm sure you've memorized it. Yeah, right. I'm sure you can anticipate what I'm going to say here. In the Gospel of John, remember, I think I've told you this before. In the Gospel of John, the fullest understanding of Jesus is as the wisdom figure, Sophia. Now, remember in Proverbs we hear about wisdom calling out from the crossroads? Wisdom inviting people to come and eat a food that never makes you hungry again, and drink that never makes you thirsty again. She's female, and she's female because the Greek word is Sophia, and Sophia has a feminine ending, so there she is, and we still name our little girl Sophia. By the way, speaking of little girls, one of those little girls who died in Nashville was a member of Woodmont Christian Church, a disciples church, who has also been rocked by this. This tragedy feels a little closer because the substitute teacher was a TCU grad. So that's been all over my feeds as well. Sophia, Jesus, Sophia. Jesus, divine wisdom. Now let me say a bit more about that. I know you can hardly wait. Right before Jesus was born, in that century before Jesus was born, in conversations among Jews, and especially Jews who could speak Greek and knew the Greek philosophers, they were talking about this wisdom figure as a kind of personification, emanation of God. So the author of the Gospel of John is picking up all that conversation and laying it within the Jesus of this gospel. So when we read, in the beginning was the word, logos, that's the Greek word, and it has a masculine ending. Just think about that. And it's the translation of the Hebrew word dabar, which has no gender. It's most likely that behind that logos was not a kind of masculine understanding of emanations from God in a kind of Gnostic way, but of this rich Jewish understanding of Sophia. So, divine Sophia is on his way to Jerusalem. And in the Gospel of John, this is the moment that both culminates his ministry and leads to his death. So here we go. Now, a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair, which, by the way, in the Gospel of John hasn't happened yet, which is always a clue that the author of the Gospel of John is writing to people who know what happened. Because otherwise we'd all go, what? We already know that. We don't go, what? Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent a message to Jesus, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, this illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now, that statement right there has a million layers, because this is why I love the Gospel of John. It has millions of layers. In the Gospel of John, glorification happens through death. What? In the Gospel of John, there's lots of language of Jesus being lifted up, Jesus being glorified, and they are always references to the cross. There's something really holy about death. So, lost my place. I should quit sermonizing. Accordingly, though, and her where he, it's obviously quite deliberate that Jesus is delaying. Now, here is the most interesting tidbit of information that has nothing to do with anything that I'm going to say today, because it really is one of my goals to always give people obscure facts that they can never use and mean absolutely nothing. Although this could be kind of significant. As I was working on this lesson, because I had the opportunity to earn a PhD and can still read my Greek, although my Hebrew's fallen off, I was looking at various ancient texts. Okay, you ready? You're going to think this is so cool, you're just going to fall over. In some texts, Martha is not mentioned. And in fact, it gives the impression that in some of the most ancient texts, and the most ancient one we have was found in the 2nd century, and it's called P66. Isn't that great? Aren't you glad you know that? And in it, it only refers to Mary, the sister of Jesus. There's no mention of Martha. And in fact, throughout that whole chapter, no mention of Martha. And in other sections of the Gospel of John where Martha shows up, which are pretty slim, there's no mention. Now, what in the world? In the oldest traditions of the New Testament, there may have been a reflection that really there was just one woman who was close to Jesus, and her name was Mary, and she's associated with the village Magdala. But get a load of this. This is really great. Okay, you ready? This is the kind of stuff that'll keep me going all week. Magdala has never been identified as a geographic location in terms of, I mean, we have a village of Magdala, and tourists go there and they just love it and fall over dead because it's so wonderful. But in the ancient world, there was no village named Magdala. That location had a different name. And in fact, it means tower. So what if the name Mary Magdalene becomes Mary the Tower of Strength, Wisdom, Grace? Isn't that interesting? And who decided that we were going to just make it a place? And then it becomes a way to say, she wasn't so important. Okay, back to the main thing. So we'll just take the text as it is right now. So after he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to the disciples, let's go to Judea again. And the disciples said to him, well, Rabbi, the Jews were just now trying to stone you. And you're going there again? Like, you idiot. Why are we going back to the place of death? Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk during the day do not stumble because they see the light of this world, but those who walk at night stumble because the light is not in them. Now, this happens all the time in the Gospel of John. All the time. The disciples are here and Jesus is here and the conversations go like this all the time. It's like one didn't even hear what the other said. You know, they're asking about, you're going back to the place that you're death, and Jesus starts going in and talk about day and night. Now that's, again, an invitation to think. Jesus is still in the day. He's still going to walk in the day. And he doesn't seem particularly afraid about those Jews that are going to stone him. All right, I lost my place again, y'all. After saying this, he told them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going to awaken him. And then get this, the disciples, of course, now they're going to connect. Well, if he's just asleep, why are we bothering? He will be all right. Now, we know Jesus is using a metaphor for death. But here's another really interesting thing that's going on. When the disciples say, he will be all right, do you know what that Greek word is? He will be saved. It's the same word that goes with salvation. It's the same word that is used all the time for saved and that language we use. Lazarus will be all right. So the disciples think he'll be all right, and as a matter of fact, they're speaking the truth because he'll be all right. He will be living in soteria is the Greek word, soteria. Jesus, however, has been speaking about his death, but they thought he was referring merely to sleep. The author thought it was necessary for us to understand that. Then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. For your sake, I'm glad I was not there so that you may believe, but let us go to him. And Thomas, who was called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, well, let's all go, that we may die with him. Now, here's the kind of interesting thing about the gospel that's always inviting us in. That him, does it refer to Lazarus, that we may die with Lazarus? Or does it refer to Jesus, that we may die with Jesus? And the grammar, because remember how we were taught in second grade grammar that the pronoun always belongs to the last name named, right? And the last name named is Lazarus. Anyway, think about that. It'll keep you going. When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. And I'm sure you've heard this. It's kind of interesting that in ancient Near East thought, this wasn't just Jewish, this was kind of everybody. And it kind of goes along with Native American religions. There's a belief that the soul kind of hangs around the body for 2 or 3 days. And so it may be that John the evangelist wants us to be sure and see that that soul is gone 4 days. It's 2 or 3 days, and now it's 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary stayed home. And Martha said to him, well, you know, Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he'll rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die? Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Why, yes, Lord. I believe you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." So here we get to the meat of the matter. What is Wisdom Jesus doing here? So in the ancient Near East and even today, although we Western Christians have pretty much made our choice about this binary, there's two ways to think about resurrection. One way is to say, as was very common in Jewish apocalyptic literature, that's the literature in which the devil and the beast are going to come down and explode everything, that the resurrection is an instance of the last judgment. And so while we're dead, when we die, we're dead. We're just dead. But at the last day, the last judgment, then all will be arisen. It'll be a moment of judgment. And we even have that in the book of Revelation where, the books of life are opened and everybody's sorted out according to where we are. And we have that even in the Gospel of Matthew where, well, you are sheep and you are goats, and I've been reading the book, so I know. Another way to think about resurrection is our more common way, but this has been going on also for centuries and centuries and centuries, and that has to do with immortality. That is to say, we generally understand this, that our souls are immortal in some ways, and that when we're buried, we're not dead, waiting for that last moment. Our souls are still continuing, so that even in the medieval period, the Roman Catholics got all caught up in whether there was a purgatory or not, and that was the place, purgatory was the place where you weren't really dead, but then you would be risen, rise on the last day. So they were trying to combine both of these ideas. But, Protestant Christians pretty much rejected that sense and have more of a sense of life ongoing, don't we? I mean, that's not shocking or new or anything. We already know that's what we're thinking about. So I'm thinking, though, and I have to go back to my notes so I can say this as precisely as possible because it's the first time I've ever thought it. I'm thinking that Jesus is introducing a third meaning. There is, in fact, for Jesus, continuity between death and life. And continuity still makes it too much of a line. In fact, death and life, for what Jesus is saying, are interwoven together. And that, in fact, death is not for Jesus a disruption, but a constant thread in life, just as life is a constant thread in death. What I'm trying to say here is that when Jesus says, "I'm the resurrection and the life, and the one who believes in me will never die," he's not talking about, and now we're going to just live forever. He's talking about the life that is available now in him, that death is inevitable, but it's fully interwoven with life. But life is redefined, not as existence, meaningless, short, but as a fullness of faith, love, and belonging that for Jesus is available here and now, not there and then. Here and now. And one of the reasons we can build this case of Jesus kind of offering a third way of thinking about death and life is because Jesus says, "I am the resurrection and the life." And whenever he says "I am" in the Gospel of John, and he says it a lot, what we need to hear behind it is the encounter of Moses and the burning bush in Exodus, When Moses says to this bush that is burning but not being consumed, well, who am I going to tell them? What's your name? Who are you? And God answers, I am. So here comes Jesus. Remember, divine wisdom. I am. It is now. It is now. And the only way, says Jesus, that I can make this make sense to you is by some sort of sign. This is what I'm trying to say. Don't get hung up on these differences. Recognize death is now. Not just the death of my husband, not just the death of our loved ones. And believe me, I live with death still in a way that is constantly grieving because, as Mike was asking me about my mother-in-law, who still lives with me, she's losing her vision. She's going to be 97. Strong, wonderful, but not well enough to come to Sunday school. My father turned 95. His wife is 93. We had lunch a few weeks ago at a restaurant in Oklahoma City, and I am quite sure the entire restaurant enjoyed our conversation because we're all deaf. I'm telling you, there's still death here, and it's not beautiful. When you get diagnosed with wet macular degeneration, that is just simple. There's nothing pretty about that. When you fall and your husband's out of town and you break your hip and you have to crawl to the phone across the room so you can get somebody to help you call the ambulance, that was my stepmother a few weeks ago. There's nothing pretty about that. And I'll tell you another thing I'm kind of mad about. Death comes in all kinds of forms. You know, I just told you about all this change. Just alluded to it. But it has meant loss. We've had to change the way we've done things. We used to be at Phillips a really close-knit little family group, you know, and we were the little seminary that could survive. You know, that's all we wanted was to survive. And there are many people in this class who are present today and who are present with us regardless of their physical presence not being here anymore, who made that happen. Phillips survived. Well, abundance of certain things. And we have to give up that little close-knit, well, you're my buddy and I'm your buddy and you're my buddy. And yeah, we're going to invite black people in, but we just hope they act like white people and that they will be our friends. And then we're going to bring in some Native Americans, but please don't talk about Vine Deloria. We just hate him. That's change. It's loss. It hurts to let go of old ways of being and doing. That's death, too. And what I'm saying here is that Jesus comes in and interrupts that focus on death by inviting us to look at life. There are some people at Phillips who have made the decision to move on as we have become who we are. When you quit being a family organization, that means that you actually have to follow procedures. Really? And if you don't, you can tell now I'm really whining about being president. If you don't follow those procedures, then some say, well, why'd you let her do that and not him? We thought we were just being nice to her. So you got to follow process and procedure. And so in that process and procedure and the changing and the growing, some people make choices to leave. Some people just leave because they got better offers. Some people just leave because it's time. It never feels good to lose these people that I have come to love and really do think like they're my family, although I try not to show that anymore. Because then somebody will say, why do you think she's your family and he's not? kind of irritated with this death thing. And Jesus is disrupting it, and he's just speaking so calmly and serenely to Martha. But then Mary shows up. When Martha had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary and told her privately, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary get up quickly and go out, and so they followed her, because they thought she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her were also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? So why is Jesus weeping now? "I'm the resurrection and the life. Why are you bugging me? I've got it all together in one bag." And then the next thing you know, he's crying his eyes out. Jesus began to weep. A standard answer, and it's a good answer. I'm saying this because next week is Easter, and it'll be interesting to see all the preachers in America. They're going to do something with this. So, okay. Turns out, I once heard a sermon from a minister who preached on Easter and never said the word resurrection. It was quite unique. And not particularly good, by the way. Okay. Why is he weeping? The standard answer is he's weeping because he saw in Lazarus his own death. So that suddenly this divine Jesus becomes real human. And so he's crying because, if Lazarus is dead, that means I'm really going to die. And so he starts crying. That's really okay. But I'm wondering if there's not another alternative. And that is that he's crying because nobody understands what he's trying to do. He has been with these people for years, and they are constantly misunderstanding what he has to say. And he looks at Mary, and he thought she really did understand, but it's clear she didn't, because she's crying about her brother, and he kept saying, "I'm the resurrection and the life," and she's sobbing her head off. And then there's the Jews, who in this chapter really look pretty good, so we ought to give them that right there, and they're crying. And so Jesus is like, "Lord, what the..." Say one more thing as an aside. So my beloved granddaughter, who lives in Louisville, Kentucky, and she's going to be 5 years old, during COVID, we had family Zoom conferences every night. Every night we sat down and Zoomed. It was so fun and wonderful, and she was about 3 years old, and her little brother had been born by then. And I was telling a story about work, which is always a great story because all of life at Phillips is so wonderful and full, and everybody just loves each other and all that other stuff, so we just get along so beautifully. And I actually said, as I was telling the story, I'm moving the microphone away. As I was saying, and so I said to them, I said to my daughter, "So I said to those people, what the My 5-year-old granddaughter, well, she was 3 at the time, went over to her little brother right there on the Zoom camera, looked at him and said, "What the hell?" I got in a lot of trouble. Oh, now I've messed up the microphone. So that's Jesus. There he is. You all still don't get it. Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Hey, Lord, you know it's really going to stink." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone, and Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I've said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they might believe that you sent me." And when he had said this, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. And Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." It's a sign. Remember way back at the beginning when he was at the wedding and they ran out of wine, and his mother came to him and said, "You know, they've run out of wine. You need to do something." And he did, and the water turned to wine. It's a sign. Remember when he is out on the hills teaching, and the people have followed him, and they need to eat, and there's not enough food, and he takes up he takes up what there is, and then he prays over it, and the next thing you know, everybody's eating. It's a sign. And now this is a sign. It's not a sign like at every wedding we're going to have, Jesus is going to turn the water into wine, although I've been to somewhere I wish Jesus would. It's not a sign that there's always going to be, whenever we bless the bread, it's just going to multiply. It's a sign to point to a different reality, a fuller reality, and that is we can't have life unless we have death. And we can't have death unless we have life. And believe me, when you're old, there are days when you think, "God, deliver me. I want it." Because the bodies aren't working so well. No, Mark. You know. So, here's what happens after that. And then I'll hush and let you talk with me. What happens after that? The Jews hear that Jesus has raised a man from the dead. He's back in Judea now, and that it's quite possible that even though it's against all better judgment, he's going to go to Jerusalem. And if he goes to Jerusalem, he's going to cause a scene. And if he causes a scene, the Romans are going to get involved. And whenever the Romans get involved, it is not pretty. We already know this. So their thinking is that if we could just get rid of Jesus, all these other things won't happen, and the Romans will stay away. And that's what we want, the Romans to stay away. And they even have this discussion in chapter 11 about, isn't it better for one person to die and not the whole nation? And that's good logic sometimes. A little weird, but good. Weird for Western Christians. So in the raising of Lazarus, Jesus signs his death warrant. In Lazarus' raising, according to John, is Jesus' death. Death and life belong together in some holy and sacred way, and we can't have one without the other. And that to live in the wisdom of Jesus, the divine wisdom, is to recognize that above all. Do y'all always have this going on? What kind of questions or responses or concerns do you have come to a really weak moment? Yeah, Mike.
Well, you kind of opened my eyes a little bit, Jay. John has always been my least favorite.
Uh-huh.
Because I like Jesus with his humanity rather than Jesus is above everything.
Mm-hmm.
may be the only place that I don't recall any kind of, so I think that's it's a very interesting point that we want.
Yeah. Which still shows his humanity.
Yeah, but I like that's the only time it.
Yeah, right. In the.
And, the I am statements. I'm trying to think of some of the fellows spoke, I can't remember his name, but he was outstanding. But he said that the I am statements that John writes, Jesus said, nearly everybody believes that was where Jesus' words.
Uh-huh.
Maybe what he was.
Uh-huh.
And the folks said it would have been so much more palatable if the disciples had said, he is the light, he is this, he is this, he is, as opposed to Jesus making it.
Oh, yes, right. Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah, so anyhow.
I wonder who that is. Did you hear Mike say that? Yeah, it brings up a really interesting point in just the way we read the whole Bible. Mike says that it would be more palatable if instead of Jesus standing up and going, I am the resurrection and the life, if he wasn't doing that, if the disciples stood around and said it. So that he is the resurrection and the life. Well, of course, that would have missed the theological point of Moses in the burning bush. But here's the other thing that's really disturbing to American Christians. And that is that in the ancient world, claiming power to oneself is, for one thing, a sign of power. And it's not a sign of false humility. It's not, we read that as boasting. And, and really, you should always wait for someone else to say that you're good at whatever it is that you're good at, and never declare it yourself. Because that's really very boastful, and my mother told me not to do that, and I'm sure your mother told you not to do that too, mainly because we wanted to be liked. But in the ancient world, those norms were completely different. Jesus didn't have any need to show any kind of false modesty, because there's nothing falsely modest about those Mediterranean peoples. Even to this day, that's not how people talk. Now, I've even discovered this in conversations, sometimes between white colleagues who are always waiting for someone else to tell them that they're good at this, and black colleagues who have learned that somebody's got to say what they're good at because nobody else is going to. So there's that kind of thing. I just think that's really interesting too. Thank you. Oh, yes. Yes. Yes.
Part of that, I think, is the proclamation he's made him say, no, you don't get it.
Yes.
And that's repeated over and over.
Right.
They still need to
Right.
speak.
And don't you find that a moment of hope?
Yes, I do.
I do, because I don't really have it all together. And it's going to take me all the way into the next world and beyond, to infinity and beyond, to get this. I can't get it. Oh, Hank is here with the microphone. Thank you. Other comments or? Yeah. Okay. Hank is coming. Mm-hmm.
I think it's a beautiful way to consider life and death together like that. It's not, what we think of as shocking and horrible and
Right.
a horrible change in our lives. It's a continuum.
Yeah, I think it is too. And a continuum that's so mixed together that we're losing if we keep trying to separate it out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, with
movie, I can't remember the source, but the phrase was, sorrow is the spade that prepares the soil. And it seems like there may be a bit of a parallel, but I've been chewing on that one for 3 or 4 months.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
My wife, a booklet that hospice hands out.
Uh-huh.
Her father's just gone into hospice. And the last sentence, when they're talking about the death of someone, is there's a group standing on the shore of the sea going, there she goes. And there's a group standing on the other side of the sea saying, here she comes. And I think that's super.
Oh, that is lovely. Thank you. Yeah. 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 So, we're beginning the. Does anyone else have anything else to say? Hank, do you have anything to say? So, we're at the beginning of this Holy Week that is made sacred and holy by the death of one that we follow, even if we don't get him. We follow him. And if we're going to follow him, there's always the invitation to go all the way. And if we're going to go all the way, it means to the cross. And there at the cross, somehow paradoxically, God's very self shows up and makes it the holiest moment of all. So